today's video. My name is Drew McCambridge and I'm a part of the TekMonks family. So my work and passion involves me in educating and helping businesses and organizations with the adoption and deployment of our solutions, promoting digital transformation really, so we're targeting the scalability, profitability, sustainability, and very important for every company we believe is the cybersecurity side of things, keeping them safe. So today I'm really excited to be showing our Monastery solution today. So essentially this is a built cloud integrated development environment, and today I'm going to be showing off our APIBoss side of things. So once I log in, I'll be able to show how we've changed this product to be able to just be a simple drag and drop solution where you can secure your APIs on the fly, and it's very user friendly, and I'm just really excited to get into it. So without any further ado, I'll log on and meet you on the other side. Welcome back. I have successfully logged into our cloud integrated development environment. So this is TekMonks development environment called Monastery, and as you can see, that actually hosts a lot of different products here that you can get in and start actually playing around with, tinkering and creating, whether it be APIs for your traditional AS400 machine, developing integrations, or even business rules. But today I'm actually going to be focusing in on the APIBoss, so it's actually how we can join this development environment to actually apply API security. And with that, let's actually double click on one of them and jump into the actual environment. And as you can see, for this demonstration, I've created a blank canvas for us so we can actually figure out what we're doing here. So there's a couple of options up here. Up top, obviously we can just exit out and go to the other environments. Open and save, and that's actually, you can save certain environments to your disk and open them up if you want to share them and stuff like that, and also download them and stuff like that. But today I'm mainly going to be talking about these three features on the sidebar here, which is API, policy tag, and obviously to publish. So what that essentially is, API, starting off, is where you create your own API, and then policy tags is really impressive and really important for the security side of things, because it's how you can actually apply certain policies and rules to these APIs, who can access them, with what kind of requirements are on these certain APIs, which I'll obviously get into later as well. And then finally the easy publishing steps, which just makes it all complete into one single package. But without further ado, let's get started on just showing how the process would be to create an API. So you'd come here and you'd drag and drop onto the canvas. You can see I've got a new API here, so of course I could just right click and rename it. Else I can also just double click here to open it up, and then here we've got our API designer. Now there is a lot to take in here, so I'll try to take it a bit slowly and just start from the top and go all the way down to the different features. So we have an exposed path, and essentially since we are securing APIs, of course there's going to at least be some exposed path. What that actually means, for example, is if our client's APIBoss was running on a server, let's just say abc.com, an exposed path for their APIs could be something like api.abc.com, and then a path to that, as a path to the server, and then / here, and then this would be where your path name would be, so whatever name you really want, really, could be anything, and that's actually the exposed path where the end user will then come to actually visit and call that API. So exposed path, as I was saying, could be something like api.abc.com / then I'd write here add user, and then the people would be able to actually call that API by just visiting there. The important thing here is that it's an exposed path and it's actually not the original path, so the real path to the actual server may have a lot more going on there, so it could be checking if there's JSON Web Token required or basic authentication required, or really checking anything like that. In general, it's just abstraction and keeping it clean and simple and very secure. Now API endpoint URL is the actual API endpoint, so what's the actual API's URL? And essentially what happens here is you can also see up top right here, importantly you can see that it says post, or essentially these are drop-down menus, and you can actually define the method that will actually call the API itself, whether it is get or post or delete or any of those API protocols examples. Now this is really important because you can actually make, for example, the exposed path as a post method, but then the original API endpoint URL was a get. That's perfectly fine actually, and actually it will do the conversion for you, so it will know, hey, you're calling this as a post, but the backend I actually need to use get, and to perform the appropriate actions to actually get your desired result. And essentially just following how the HTTP protocol, the backbone of the internet, originally works by supporting these various methods. So now over here you can see this area is injected headers. This is really important as well because it means you can actually inject headers. So regarding the API registry in APIBoss, we actually have this ability to inject headers to begin with. So what I'm actually saying is when I call the backend, I'm going to inject headers with these parameters. For example, I could make a header API key, and then the actual value is the key. This is really crucial because when I have these kind of injected headers, I can have situations, for example, where my backend is actually requesting a key, and you don't actually want to expose this key to the client itself. So down here we also have pass-through headers. So what these are is essentially pretty much it's if I have some headers. Originally it's actually all by default stripped because for security purposes we don't just want any kind of headers to be going through. But what happens here is if you actually include header names here, it then says, okay, I'll let these go through to the backend without actually modifying it, as I said before. Otherwise they would be stripped just for security reasons because many exploits can take place with that really. And so that's really crucial too. And then over here is actually super important as well. We've got the REST API and it's set to yes. Here you can actually toggle this on and off with a simple drop down menu, but essentially that's just where you can say no, it's not. And then while REST APIs are very common, it's actually pretty much the foundation of internet communication and the backbone of it. We actually support other formats here, so you could say no and then down in the content type in what the content was. So for example, it could be XML, and essentially what that really means is that you could then utilize this. So if you had, say, a web server that was made in the early 2000s that's actually a bit dated now, but it's using XML, you could still expose that through APIBoss, or even it doesn't have to be XML, it could be really anything, it could even be like a binary format or something like that. You could then say no and then put in the actual content type, and then APIBoss will actually be able to take that in and actually still secure that API. Move on here, I almost forgot a really important feature actually, is that you can see this big square here called Upload Open API Spec. Now, as the name implies, this is where you would be able to upload your Open API specs in the actual definition of the Open API spec format. So this allows us to understand what's actually the input and the output interface for the API. If you actually uploaded your spec here, it also autofills the backend URL, as the Open API spec includes that, but it actually can also still be modified while actually editing it. So that's really important and crucial too. But what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to head it back to the canvas that was previously shown. So I didn't actually create the API, I was just showing what you can do with it. But what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to cut it a bit here and show a more completed canvas with two APIs and some policies so I can dive into a more deeper explanation of securing the actual APIs by applying some policies to them. And without any further ado, I'll get into that. So just bear with me briefly, and I'll be back very shortly with a different canvas here. Now I'm back, and I've actually filled it out a bit more. And now this is where we can get really creative today. So essentially, it's a little complicated what I'm going to go through right now, so I'll try to take it really slowly. But as an example, we can see, let's say there's a customer that wants to call an API that's placed on the top left that I put up here, which is this query customer API. And essentially now that could be fine, but something you can see here is there's something called policies. And what that means is essentially we can take a step back and look at the context here, or at least try to figure out, it's not as black and white of who can call this API. There really should be some fine-grained tuning here of essentially what restrictions or constraints should we actually put on a particular user. This is actually where policies come in. So as I was saying before, there's going to be a policy section, and essentially what this is where you can actually create a properly secure API environment. If I'm going to overview this canvas in front of you in the first place, we have two APIs here, and that is query customer API up here and an update client API. There's also two policies down here. So as we can see, we've got a gold policy and a silver policy, and now just actually, you can see the arrows as well, that just dictates which policies are applied to which API, and it's as simple as a quick drag and drop. I literally just drag the policy onto the API, and that applies the policy to said API. So as you can see in this situation, we have gold, silver, and the query customer API has both gold and silver policy applied to it, but the update client API only has this silver policy applied to it. So essentially what we can then do with this is how do we know which to enforce for which client? And that's easy because these two policies both have their own API keys. So this actually essentially is this discriminant. And what that means is if I've given this API here two policies, so it has gold and silver policy, this query customer API, that actually means that it has two keys, a silver and a gold key now. What we can then get from that is when I tell my clients, hey, you can call this query customer API, I can give one essentially this gold key, and then I can give another the silver key. And what that obviously means is if a customer is querying it with a gold key, the API then knows, hey, I should be applying the gold policy to this user. And if someone was calling it for the silver key, likewise, they would then enforce this silver policy on that user. So this policy architecture enforcement is really great, and it can feel quite simple, drag and drop and then drag to the particular API to enforce it, but we can start getting really creative here, and we can dive into it and get really nitty-gritty with it, because now I can have different policies that can divide, say, my customers into different groups and charge them as such. So if I have people who are paying for gold, they can then access this API and a gold policy, and if they're paying for silver, they can access it from silver policy. So that's a kind of quick overview of just applying it to the actual API, but what do I actually mean as well? Let's get into the policy creation itself and figure out what really can we do with this. And as I was showing before with the API, it's as simple as just a drag and drop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag and drop this API onto the board. We can see it's a new policy, so we can fill out a blank policy and kind of get into the fields it has. So let me just double click real quick. And as we can see, we've got a bunch of fields here. So this gives us a clear understanding of what's really important for the actual security and creating some clear segmentation. A difference here with the API editor policy is, of course, that what I was showing before with the API, that's a lot of back-end stuff. What in front of us today is a lot more just rules on the front-end side of things, or essentially what I actually can do when they call this API, or what do they actually require to be able to call it. So first thing, as I was saying, we have an API key here. So this is where you would then say the specific key for, if I was making it the gold policy, right? This would be where I create the gold key. And each policy then has its unique key, and that's how, the customers or the clients that are calling these APIs, they have the specific key, to then be essentially run across that policy to be able to access this API or not. So as I was saying, essentially then the next one would be that first row here, we have basic authentication. And what that means is every option here, basic authentication, needs JSON Web Tokens or rate enforcement. We can toggle with a yes or a no, so I'll go through them now. But essentially, basic authentication, you say yes or no here, and of course, if you say yes, then you actually must provide a user ID and a password, meaning that if anyone actually calls this API, they have to use the basic authentication, and HTTP actually already supports this. It's actually built into the HTTP basic authentication protocol, and we're just supporting it here. Now next here is the JWT tokens, so that's JSON Web Tokens. Again, as I was saying, this is a yes or no is pretty much required here, and if you say yes, you then need to fill out the actual subject of this token required. So for an example, if we had an API that needs a JSON Web Token and you call it, but we can also say what's the subject required here, and that subject is access, it essentially means the type of this must actually be of type access. So you could also have a token, for example, you could put in here admin or even comma separated values such as admin/access. And then what we can really get to here is that, so say when you actually click yes, you need a JW token, you are going to have to give me what you should actually have that token for access in the first place. As a kind of example of what I'm saying is, we might have someone that's authenticated in a separate API and they've been authenticated successfully and thus given an admin key. They are then able to actually access this API if we enforce it and say that they must have an admin key. Otherwise, if they didn't have this admin key, they wouldn't be able to access any of the APIs that this policy that has this JSON Web Token requirement and access key subject, that would then be blocking those users who are not properly authenticated. And now down here is really important is actually the rate enforcement, which essentially is where we can bring in those example of the gold and silver policies really, and separating it for the clients in terms of payments really as an example. So first we could say something like, I do rate enforcement, yes, and then we have a per second, per minute, per hour, per day, per month, per year field. And what that really means is essentially I can give an example of, hey, every second you're allowed to call, let's say, 10,000 times this API. And then I can also say per minute 20,000. But what that actually means here is that's how we support burst rate. So it's important because, again, if I do say something like you can have 10,000 API calls a second, having more definition here can really fine-tune your API. Essentially, who can call it and the requirements to call it, right? So of course, per second 10,000, but per minute 20,000. That doesn't mean you can do every single tick in 10,000. So we're increasing and limiting the cap here of saying, yeah, you can actually call 10,000 per second, but in that minute you can only do a total of 20,000. So of course, first 2 seconds maybe 10,000, then from there you couldn't. Or essentially you can do 1,000 every second for 20 seconds, for example, like that. And now this again is really important. If you actually did, of course, want to actually support, hey, you can do 10,000 calls per second for the entire minute, then of course for the actual minute you'd have to implement and enter in 600K, which is perfectly fine. But that's just how you can really start to get that gold and silver requirement across here. So you can say, hey, the gold users can call up to 100,000 per minute or per hour, day, whatever you want to put here, and then you can say, but the silvers, they only have 10,000, or even bronze, they only have 1,000, or free people have 100 or something like that. So you can get really fine-grained here. So that's really important, and essentially that's how you can segment your access on these APIs, and that's how you would apply these policies. So essentially all of these all of these policies have these fields, and that's how you can create a really complicated architecture with something that's very simple in front of you, but you can get really creative with it. So that was the overview of the policies, and now what I want to actually do is what I want to hit home what I've shown today is that we can create policies and we can create APIs, and then we can actually apply. So APIs have certain policies or certain rules. You can get really fine detailed with it, and essentially you can get really complicated with it, but it's so easy to digest in the first place on the dashboard and to actually build and even publish, which I'm about to show you right now. So if we wanted to publish this whole set we've done today, which is the 2 APIs and their certain policies, we then just come down to this publish button here, give it a click, and a pop-up comes up, and that's where we can fill out the package name. So we can call it customer something package. We can enter in the server IP address, which is just your APIBoss IP address. Port is the port number it's running on. Usually we say port 9090. Your admin ID or admin password. You go and hit publish, and you're away laughing, and you've created your package. So that's the kind of overview on the admin side of things. Now what I actually wanted to do is log off and actually show developer side of things. And because what would they actually see when they visit the portal, or external clients they visit the portal, because they're not going to actually see this kind of publishing of the APIs. They might actually just want to get the APIs or even use them to begin with. So I'd like to quickly log off, and I'll meet you on the login screen, and we can go from there. Screen. And essentially what I'm going to do is log in with a set of different credentials, and this is actually how developers or third-party, your external clients, can actually access their developer portal. And what that means is they are not actually publishers, or they're not administrators, is what I was showing before as the actual publishing or administrative portal, and actually being able to create these packages in the first place. These are actually your external partners or your business who essentially are logging on to call your APIs, or even what I'm going to show you soon, some really cool features of actually getting a generated source code that they can actually implement into their product, which essentially lets them easily call these APIs as you would like them to. Alright, so I'm just going to log in, so I'll be right back in a second again, and we'll see the new portal. So as we can see here, the view is quite different to what we were previously looking at. Here's actually the developers or the external partners and their own page, and this is where they can access packages that you've published. As I was referring to earlier, the actual publishing section, you can enter in the package name, and as you can actually see up here, it just says please double click the API package to explore. So as a developer, I can come in here and say, hey, let's look at the customer's API package. So I'm going to go ahead and double click now and open up the new UI, and as you can see, this is pretty much the documentation for what the developers actually need. It says, hey, you can call these APIs. So up top we have a description that says this API allows the caller to query customers by customer name, and customer name is the actual only required parameter here. So we have some input fields here, and it pretty much lets, hey, this is actually unchangeable by the way because it was previously published by the admin or publisher, but it lets them know, hey, when you're calling this API, you can input a customer string, and you're going to actually get returned a customer name and an address, also in the string format. And then something to notice here is that the box up here is a string, and it's not a drop-down because, again, this was defined by the publisher and admin. You can only actually input a string here, so you could type in the customer name for this API, and then this box down here, which is the JSON response. Essentially, this is actually how you would get your response back if you want to, which I'm going to explain very soon. Try it out. But as you can see down here, there's actually the method. This is the method for calling the API. Something to note here again it is also blued out. It doesn't have the drop-down options because, again, the publisher or the admin that created this API dictated it to be a post method. So you also have the API key we were talking about, the JW token we were talking about, you have to input, and if you were also using HTTP authentication, it would be the user ID and the password. The developer can then enter this stuff here. Just click this button down at the bottom right corner, try it up here, and then essentially what happens is the response would then be popped into this response here, and they can actually test out the API. Now these other three buttons, which are really cool and really impressive, is you can actually, you see the one down there that says Node.js client, there's also Java client and curl client. What you can do is you can click these buttons and actually download a script of essentially the API called for you with your input, and then they can just copy and paste it into the program that they're working on, and they don't have to figure out how to get it running. It's all there ready for them to just implement as easy as they can and just run away with it. So it's a really cool feature, saves a lot of time and headaches, I'm sure. And essentially that's the developer side of things on how they can easily get in and start accessing your APIs that you've given them and all that jazz. So really it's a really cool way to get integrated. And again, the main thing about this portal is it's extracting away from all that heavy code-based stuff where you can actually just see a much more refreshed, confined, easy UI to actually understand what you're doing and get work done much faster and essentially deliver things much easier. From my end, that's pretty much it today. Again, I covered the basics of creating an API, creating the policies for the admins, and actually publishing them. And I quickly wrapped up here on how a developer can access these APIs and actually get them either downloaded as scripts to then copy paste into their own programs or actually test out the APIs on the portal itself. It's all fully there and really great and really fun to actually use. So that's everything from me. I will essentially throw up my email on the screen after this video ends, just in case anyone wants to contact me. I'd be happy to answer any questions at any time. You can reach out to support@tekmonks.com or alternatively dewar.mccambridge@tekmonks.com. My name's a little complicated, so for sure I'll be putting it on the screen, which would be much easier for you guys to read. And I just want to thank you all for your time today, wherever you are in the world listening to this, day or night. Have a good day or night, and I appreciate checking out APIBoss, and thank you again for your time, and I appreciate it. See you.